Good to
Yeah.
go. Okay, hi everyone. Good to see everyone. Welcome to this joint briefing and Q&A by Nuclear Information Service, NIS, and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, C&D, who I'm sure you both know very well. So today we'll be exploring the main activities under the Mutual Defense Agreement, MDA. So those are the three acronyms you need to know, or initialisms, NIS, C&D, MDA. And so we're going to talk about the MDA and what the proposed amendments to it could mean. So my name's Tim Street, and I'll be chairing the webinar. I am the chair of NIS. So our two speakers today are Kate Hudson from C&D, who I'm sure you know, and David Cullen from NIS. So Kate has been General Secretary of C&D since 2010, having served as chair since 2003. And by profession, Kate is a historian. And she was head of social and policy studies at London South Bank University prior to working for C&D. She is author of several books, including A History of C&D, which I have on my bookshelf. David is the main researcher and spokesperson of NIS. He's the author of NIS Reports, Trouble Ahead, Risks and Rising Costs in the UK Nuclear Weapons Programme, and Extreme Circumstances, the UK's nuclear warhead in context. David is Chair of Trustees for the Conflict and Environment Observatory and co-chair of the UK Office for Nuclear Regulations NGO Forum. So about today, so the MDA is the treaty that governs the relationship between the nuclear weapons programs of the United Kingdom and the United States. It has been regularly reviewed and extended since it came into force in the 1950s. The current treaty expires at the end of this year, and the government has announced proposed amendments that would make the treaty permanent. This runs counter to the UK's disarmament obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So parliamentarians here have until 23rd of October, so that's only a week away really, to raise any objections to the agreement. You can ask your MP to sign EDM, that's Early Day Motion 123, calling for a debate on the agreement, and you can use the C&D website to do that. Find your MP and send them a message about it. So please do check out the NIS and C&D websites and consider donating and joining these groups. So also just some housekeeping, please remain muted and post your questions in the chat or raise your hand at the end of the contributions. So Kate is kicking us off today. That's all from me. I will mute, and Kate, if you can go ahead.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim. I was going to say great to see everyone. I can't see you actually, but thanks to everyone for joining us today. And as Tim has pointed out, this is incredibly timely because it's really like mid next week that MPs have got the opportunity to actually stand up and say something about this. So as Tim says, if you could possibly urge your MP to sign the help us build up a little head of steam there. So thanks for your support with that. So I'm going to start off the discussion by talking, excuse me, about the origins of the Mutual Defence Agreement, how it came about, and so on. And then David's going to tell us about the current situation. So I think it's fair to say that US-UK nuclear cooperation on the scale we know today only actually started with this treaty in 1958. And prior to that, the relationship between the two countries was actually much more fraught. As you're aware, I'm sure research into nuclear weapons was developing in a number of countries in the 1930s, including Britain. There was a lot of awareness about the development of war coming on and the possibility of these new types of weapons. And so in Britain, in the early part of World War II, a company called Tube Alloys was set up as a nuclear program, and there was research ongoing there. But of course, Britain really struggled with costs while at war, particularly in the early part. So in 1943, Tube Alloys was merged with the Manhattan Project, which is very well known about now, at least in part thanks to the film Oppenheimer. So the UK assumed that this cooperation would continue after the war. You know, we were wartime allies and so on. They thought that would continue. But actually, the United States ended cooperation in 1946 with the passing of the US Atomic Energy Act. And it actually became illegal under pain of death to pass restricted nuclear data on, even to allies like the United Kingdom. Speculating about why, well, it's thought that it was likely the result of active espionage amongst British physicists. So the US was determined the Soviet Union shouldn't get the same kind of technology, so it wanted to kind of seal off this, what they saw as a leaky relationship with Britain. So the United Kingdom restarted its own programme under the title this time of High Explosive Research, and it seems to have been driven by a fear of the loss of great power status. And of course, I think we'll all be aware that status related to nuclear weapons is still an ongoing factor as to why Britain continues to maintain nuclear weapons. And this was very clearly stated by former Prime Minister Blair in his autobiography. When he was talking about Trident replacement, he said not to replace Trident would be too great a downgrading of our status as a nation. So this kind of status question has been a big factor throughout and continues to be today. So this status concern was also made clear in 1949, when at that time the US offered to let Britain have nukes if they curtailed their own programs. They would just really be a subsidiary of the US. And this was rejected by the UK, and they said then it was incompatible with their status as a first-class power to depend on others for nukes. So the US dropped its proposal and it backed off, particularly as more British physicists were revealed as being involved in espionage. Then Britain's own nuclear development took a step forward. Britain's first nuclear test took place in 1952 in Western Australia. And that bomb, it was more advanced than the early US bombs, but it was actually several years behind where the US had got to at that point. And in fact, that same year, the United States tested a hydrogen bomb, and it put it well ahead in the kind of arms race stakes, so to speak. And so it saw little benefit in sharing technology with the UK. But meanwhile, of course, in the world, other developments were taking place, political events were taking place. And most particularly, I think, the 1956 Suez Crisis was incredibly important in this process, because it effectively destroyed Britain's claim to an independent imperial role. I won't go into it, I'm sure you probably know about it anyway, but essentially during the war there over the Suez Crisis, the United States humiliated both the UK and France and established itself as undisputed Western leader. So Britain was given a kicking, and so US-UK relations were at a low ebb. But then things began to change. In 1957, the UK successfully tested its own hydrogen bomb, so it was catching up there with the United States. But the real change came in October 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and that was the world's first artificial satellite. So in this space race, where the United States probably thought it was ahead, actually the Soviet Union got there first in terms of launching Sputnik. So that put the Soviet Union ahead of the US in the space race. Looking back, it's clear that although populations generally thought the space race was an exciting thing and it was about exploring and pushing new boundaries and all that, in actual fact, it was very much a military-based process, as of course space things are today. So the US probably had a bit of a panic there, and that's when the US and UK decided to make up and essentially pool their resources. And that was really the beginning of it, and that was the foundation of the MDA. First of all, there was an agreement that the United States could station Thor missiles, that's intermediate range ballistic missiles, in Britain. Thor missile bases were built in East Anglia. And this is where it starts to dovetail with peace movement activity and CND activity in particular, because the Direct Action Committee, one of the forerunners of CND, was very active in East Anglia at the bases, or trying to stop the bases being built. And there's some great photographs of our late Vice President Pat Arrowsmith actually there at one of those missile bases, you know, trying to obstruct cement mixers and so on. And CND also came and demonstrated nearby, near the direct action. So that was kind of us really engaging there in at the start. So even though there was still some US opposition to cooperation with Britain, opposition really dropped away. And so the Mutual Defence Agreement was signed into law in July 1958. So just a few months after the founding of CND in February 1958. The UK rapidly became dependent on the US for its nukes. It lacked enough resources to produce and sustain its own. And through the Mutual Defence Agreement, that subsidiary relationship continues today. Thanks, Tim.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kate, for that overview, which is really useful. And Dave, would you like to go next?
Yep, indeed. Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a bit about the current state of the treaty and the proposed changes, and I'm going to do it by talking you through the work that we've done at NIS in producing a briefing on the treaty. So there's a few pictures that you should be able to see. Some of these might be a bit difficult to read, but it won't be necessary to read them for you to understand what I'm talking about. It's just there as a sort of illustration, so you don't have to put up with my face too much. So we wanted to highlight, first of all, the fact that the change in the treaty was coming this year, as already mentioned. Article 3 bis, which governs the sharing of non-nuclear components and nuclear material for nuclear warheads, has a time limit, or up until the currently proposed changes has always had a time limit, and that was due to run out at the end of this year. So we wrote this briefing in anticipation of that change, and I'll talk you through some of the things we did, and then I'll talk about the proposed changes. So we did some freedom of information work, looking at various things. Most of our requests were rejected, but we were able to get some figures on the transfer of non-nuclear components between 2020 and 2023. You can see the figures there on your screens. A couple of things that I would highlight about these is the quite substantial jump between 2020 and 2021. It's unfortunate we don't have years before 2019, but that does look like, well, it does definitely double between those years. It would be interesting to see if that was a temporary dip or not, but it's quite possible, if not likely, that this increase is connected with the 2021 integrated review, where the UK announced that it was increasing the size of its warhead stockpile. And from this data and other observable data, it does look like they then stepped up production of nuclear weapons, that the stockpile has increased to follow that announcement. The other thing to note about it, of course, is that the transfers from the US to the UK are much more substantial than the transfers in the other direction, about 10 times as much, roughly. And again, this aligns with what we knew to be the case with the treaty. It's not entirely omnidirectional, but it is very much a case of the US enabling the UK to be a nuclear weapon state, at least to the level of technical complexity and at the cost it currently incurs. We also looked at the functioning of joint working groups. This is the slide you're probably not able to read, but just to explain what you're looking at, the joint working groups are committees staffed by people working in both the American and the British nuclear weapons programs, and they get together for periodic meetings where they present to each other, sometimes agree joint research programs. And this graphic is showing over the years since the treaty was signed which groups have been active and the kinds of things they've been working on. Again, you can find this in our briefing and you can peruse it at your leisure. But the kinds of things they're currently working on, is accident response as an example. They've had explosives research almost throughout the whole time the treaty's been in effect. They have a joint working group on infrastructure and currently on beating missile defense. One thing to note, you might see the shaded out cells in the right-hand column. These are groups we're not able to establish whether they're currently working, because the freedom of information request that was put in about these, they refused to confirm some of the information. This is changed from how frank they've been in the past, and fits in with the larger picture we're seeing of increasing secrecy in the program. Probably some of the groups that they didn't want to tell us about are working on the new warheads that the UK and the US are developing together, and possibly on their re-entry vehicles. And moving on to the other part of the briefing, which is that we pulled together a text of the treaty. One of the things that I wasn't aware of when I started working on this was that neither the UK nor the US publishes an official current treaty text. What the amendments over the years look like is a sort of change log. So they say delete this sentence and insert this other sentence instead. And there've been quite a few. I think there've been 9 over the years. In fact, the reason that Article 3 bis is entitled that way is that it's actually was agreed after the main treaty in 1959 and was inserted in between Articles 3 and 4, hence Article 3 bis. So what we did with the briefing was quite a substantial part of the briefing is a consolidated text of the treaty as it currently stands. And with those changes, you can actually see that there were some stylistic inconsistencies that have built up over the years. So we pulled that all together, and it kind of looks like this. You can see the title of the original treaty, and then below it, you can see the text of the treaty with parts highlighted that have been changed. And I'm just going to talk you through some of the changes that have been made over the years to give you a general idea of what was done. So you can see this top example here. One of the things they've had to manage is that over the years, the titles and types of information that the two states considered classified and assigned to different sort of classification levels has changed. So they've had to make changes to adapt to that new terminology. You can see in the middle example here in the grey text, they actually made a change where the US previously would supply the UK with enriched uranium, and they made a change to allow the US to arrange enrichment. So they allowed for enrichment by third parties rather than by the US for this enriched uranium that was transferred. And I think this is a really good example of how the treaty is very much a live document, and it reflects changes to the practice between the two states of what they've been doing and what's been shared. At the bottom, a change that was made in 2014 was that to allow the US to transfer multiple submarine reactors or parts of reactors or fuel. So when the treaty was originally concluded, a single submarine reactor was given to the UK, which was kind of its stepping stone into being a nuclear submarine operator. That went into the original HMS Dreadnought, and the idea was the UK would work with this and operate it, and that would help us to develop the capabilities to then create our own submarine reactors. In 2014, this article was changed so that multiple reactors or parts or fuel could be transferred. And again, this fits in with what we believe to be the case, which is that the US is supplying the UK currently with fuel for its submarine reactors. I'm happy to answer some questions about that in the Q&A if people have further questions. The changes in 2024, the proposed changes, are much more substantial and quite different from what we've seen in the past. So it's a real root and branch change. Of the 13 articles in the treaty, 12 of them have been changed or are proposed to be changed, and 5 of those have been rewritten. I would flag up, although they have been rewritten, those 5 articles, it's not that they've completely thrown out everything that was there before. It's just that the changes are sufficiently substantial that it made sense to just rewrite it rather than have a lot of very fiddly changes. But the main thing, and a major reason why we're having this webinar today is the removal of the time limits in Article 3 bis. So they've just scrubbed all of the dates from that, so that the sharing under that article will continue indefinitely. Another quite substantial change is that the transfer of reactors, parts and fuel has been made reciprocal. So previously it was just the US supplying those or being able to supply those to the UK. Now the exchange can go in both directions, and our reading of that is that it's something that we might see in the future. Part of our analysis about the AUKUS project, so that's the Australian, UK, US nuclear submarine cooperation arrangements. Initially nuclear submarines, but there are some further pillars in different areas, but initially nuclear submarines. Part of our analysis in this has been that a major motivating factor for AUKUS was to provide financial support to the UK's submarine supply chain, particularly to Rolls-Royce. And with this change in the MDA, it's possible that we might see in a future generation of US submarines that they would use components manufactured in the UK by Rolls-Royce. So that kind of fits in with that picture. Another change, which again, I don't think is going to have an immediate effect, but might do in the future, is that the parts of the treaty dealing with reactor transfer, they've changed it so that it's no longer just submarine reactors, it's any naval reactor. So I don't think this is something we're going to see in the immediate future, but it's possible at some point in the future we might see they're holding open the possibility that there might be nuclear powered ships that the UK operates, surface ships, and those might use parts coming from the US. A lot of the changes, though, are just a very substantial tidying up exercise. So I've got 3 examples here, which you don't feel you need to read through them, but I'll talk you through what they are. At the top here, we have some updated terminology on information classification categories, which I've mentioned before have been something they've had to change in the past. They've also, in this center example, they've actually got some text saying if there is a future update to information classification terminology, this treaty should be read using the new terminology rather than the old. So they're kind of future-proofing it here. And at the bottom, you can see there's 2 clauses that allow for the states to conclude implementing instruments. So these are agreements that aren't treaties, but they're about how the treaty will be operating. And at the bottom, there's a clause saying that neither party will allow dispute settlement mechanisms to be used. So my reading of this, I'm not an international lawyer, but my reading of this is that it's future-proofing the treaty so that, for example, an international court, like the International Court of Justice, couldn't rule on how the treaty was operating. They couldn't overrule what the 2 states decide between themselves. So all of these changes together, I think, give us quite a clear idea of what's intended with the treaty, that there won't be amendments of the type that we've seen since the 1950s, that actually future changes to the operating of the treaty and the operating of the relationship will be carried out through these implementing agreements. My expectation is that because these are not treaties as such, they're implementing agreements, they won't be subject to the same level of legislative scrutiny. So the US Congress has to approve all treaty changes, and there's a mechanism in the UK Parliament for the Parliament to object to treaties that are going to be signed. So I would expect that the implementing agreements would not be subject to that kind of scrutiny. And as you can see from the example with this, the information classification terminology, they've rewritten the treaty, hoping to remove reasons that in the past they've had to come back and revise the treaty. And this last point here is just again reminding you that the 23rd of October is the closing date for the window for the UK Parliament to object to the treaty being signed. Okay, thanks. That's everything that I wanted to talk about initially. I think we'll now probably go to any questions that anyone has.
Lovely, Dave. Thank you so much. So please post your questions in the chat and I can read them, or I will have a look at list of people. And if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, please do so. Otherwise, I will. Oh, Tom has raised his hand. So, yeah, Tom, please do unmute and you can ask your question. Tom Cuthbert, if you are there. Let me go ahead. Oh, I have to allow you to ask.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Tim. That's lovely. This carries on a very useful conversation we had at conference on Saturday. My question is, what sort of information in a complicated area should we convey to our members to campaign on this? Clearly, the indefinite extension is something which is pretty annoying, and it's not exactly a vote of confidence in Defence Minister Healy's explanation of it as an example of sort of Starmerism. You know, Labour's getting a lot of criticism at the moment. Is this yet another example of his approach being undemocratic?
So thanks, Tom, for your question. Dave or Kate, would you like to answer that?
I can come in first, if that's okay with David. Yeah, I think that obviously there's a very limited time slot here in terms of engaging with our members. As Tim said at the start, it's great if people can lobby their MPs, but it's not an issue that will go away for us once the MDA time frame has been settled. And so I think what will happen is that we will move away from an explicit focus on this MDA moment and broaden it out to our wider concerns about the special nuclear relationship with the United States. And obviously that's something that we do continually, either around the replacement of Trident, and obviously in some respects that's very much a kind of dual project, you know, between the two states. We know it's not really a British system. So that continues around that. And then, of course, in another respect, the special nuclear relationship is indicated very strongly by what's happening at Lakenheath. You know, that's a slightly different category of thing, but nevertheless, it is this unflinching cooperation between the US and the UK, where basically the UK allows the US to do what it wants, i.e. put nukes in East Anglia again. So our work will continue on this, even though the framing will move away from the specific parliamentary aspect of the MDA.
Great, thanks, Kate. And Tom has come back there. The MDA issue works well with the protests in Lakenheath, as Kate just said, correct. I've
Just wanted to come in on one aspect of that, though.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Just to say, although this announced the changes were announced actually in late July, so after the election under the Starmer government, it seems to be the case that these have been negotiated for quite a while. So they would primarily, I think, have been agreed under the previous government. The detail and the scale of the changes, I think, has probably been months or if not years of work for several people, you know, really going through the thing with the fine tooth comb and, as I say, future-proofing it with the, you know, once presumably the in principle agreement for the indefinite extension had been made.
Thank you, David. So someone's just asked about the EDM. So I've posted the EDM from the Parliament's website, so you can check that out. And also I've posted as a link in the chat CND's action page where you can write to your MP asking them to sign the EDM. So do check those links out. So now, Chris Coppock, I believe you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question? Please unmute and you can go for it.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to point out the chat is disabled, so I couldn't ask in the chat. My question, what I think Kate's partly answered it, was about the bases and the US forces and bases in this country, which I understand is a different agreement. Is there any overlap between the two agreements, and I don't know if there's like a sunset clause in the joint forces agreement or whatever it is, but can we expect to see a similar removal of any review capacity in the agreement governing bases and forces over here? Thank you.
Go ahead, David. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, well, I don't know if Kate knows more about this than me. I don't know very many details about the forces agreement, unfortunately.
Sorry, I don't either.
Okay, but that's something I'm sure online there is information about if that's the status of the forces agreement. I think people have discussed that. I know Matt Kennard in his recent work has, and he's done interviews where he's discussed the agreements between the US and UK on that kind of stuff. So check out Matt Kennard's work for Declassified UK. So Rob Forsyth asks, how much knowledge of the background David outlined do you think MPs have? Presumably a copy of Mrs. recent report is in the House of Commons library. So that's one for you, Dave.
We certainly did supply the House of Commons library with a copy of the report. I know that they have published their own briefing, which discusses some of these matters, and I think the work they've done on that has been very solid. So I don't feel there's great awareness about MPs about this. I mean, it's worth remembering where we are in terms of the parliamentary cycle. We're not long after an election, a lot of new MPs. You know, these changes have been announced at a time when the select committees, who might in, you know, less busy time of the parliamentary calendar, might have scheduled some investigations into this or hearings on this. They, I think, have only recently been formed. You know, I think the chairs of the committee were appointed in September. Possibly the committee members are now in place, but they certainly weren't a month ago. So there's, I think, a lot going on in Parliament, and I think there's probably not as much awareness about this as there should be.
Thanks for that. Kate, did you want to come in? Yep.
Well, just, I mean, David's right. I think part of the problem is that the period, the kind of Ponsonby rule period, where basically it can be prioritised if MPs want to pick it up, was kind of split between a few days before the summer holiday, so to speak, which is long, as we know, for MPs, and then a few days afterwards, which was all broken up with party conferences. You know, so it's. Am I saying they've done that on purpose? I don't know. But nevertheless, it has made it difficult to really build up that kind of scrutiny. And so this time, even though it's more important, we've got a lot less scrutiny and interest going on certainly than we had 20 years ago when Alan Simpson really raised the issue in a big way, and certainly less than 10 years ago when Jeremy Corbyn, on behalf of parliamentary CND, was able to raise it more than has been the case this time. So it's difficult and unfortunate, I would say, because it is really a loss. It's a loss of democratic control over something that's very important.
Just to echo that, I think 10 years ago when there was the debate, I think it was jointly arranged between Jeremy and Julian Lewis, who, whilst a supporter of nuclear weapons, was, you know, interested in having a parliamentary debate on it, and I guess in putting his case in favour of them. But I think they jointly, from what I understand from what he said, they jointly arranged for that debate to take place, and that's exactly the kind of collective, you know, discussions and arrangements that can't really take place when MPs are all over the shop and they're not actually meeting in Parliament, and you know, ordinary business isn't taking place.
Okay, so I think, Chris, did you want to come back? And Chris, go on then, Kate.
I tried to post in chat the parliamentary library briefing stuff about the status of forces agreement, but I'm only able to post to hosts and panelists. So I don't know, you obviously have the capacity there to post to everyone, so I don't know if you're able to share that. Sorry to interrupt, Chris.
No problem. Yes, I will do that. All right. Now, host and panelist, everyone. Okay, let's do
I've
that.
done it.
Oh, you've done it. Wicked. So cool. So Chris Coppock, do you want to come? You've still got your hand raised, so please come back if you need to. Which requires you to unmute. Otherwise, I will go on to the next question. I'm going to go on to the next question. So Tom Cuthbert has a follow-up question, and I might indulge myself by asking questions. Do you think the parties who want the MDA have pulled a fast one on those who want democracy? Can this be put as an objection?
Well, I would say yes, and probably not, in brief.
I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on the process that Parliament has to object to this. I think they probably could object on any grounds they like. I mean, the way it works is they would have to pass a resolution delaying the signing of the treaty, and Parliament doesn't have the right to overrule a treaty being signed, but they do have the right to delay the signing. And there's a sort of process that can be repeated indefinitely of the government wanting to go ahead and signing and the Parliament objecting to it. And I guess this is set up with the expectation that at some point the two sides will have to get their heads together and agree if they're at loggerheads. But to my knowledge, I don't think this is used very much, and certainly hasn't been for this treaty.
Great, Chris, you can still come back in if you want to, and everyone else, you've still got a bit of time. So do post your questions.
No, I don't.
or
I
raise
don't
your
have
hand.
anything
Oh,
else
okay.
to offer. Obviously, I'm a
Chris.
little bit. I'm a little bit disappointed by the not getting an answer on that one, because I'm sure there must be some sort of interlocking between the MDA and the status of Forces Agreement. But I'll leave it there.
I'm sorry that's the case, that you're disappointed. I think the interlocking, if it exists, is informal. The MDA covers certain activities quite explicitly, and whilst the sort of general spirit of cooperation and the sort of interaction that they have is obviously related to the the operation of bases, and particularly the stationing of US nukes in the UK, it's not formally governed by the MDA. And so that's why that we don't have the answer to that, I'm afraid, ready to give you. But the research that Kate mentioned, I've posted that in the chat. So there should be some further information there. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And the question I was going to ask, and we've recently seen movement on the Diego Garcia issue of this, is that you do have this kind of web of agreements between the US and UK from different periods of time. So my question to both of you was really, it seems fairly clear from the UK historically what it got out of the MDA and also the related Polaris sales agreement, because otherwise the UK, it was unlikely that the UK could retain a credible nuclear deterrent in its own phrasing. It really required at that time US support, US technological support and information support in the 50s. But what do you both think the US has historically got out of the MDA and related agreements on this? It's sometimes less clear about it. So maybe if you could touch on that on historic note.
I don't mind having a go on that. I mean, it's Dave would know more than me as to whether the UK does contribute anything technologically. It may do. I mean, it may be that there are areas of expertise which are beneficial to the US military and nuclear establishment. I wouldn't rule that out. But given the kind of overwhelming superiority they have in terms of resources and financing and staffing and research and so on, I guess they could get over that, if Britain was suddenly no longer part of that. But looking at Dave's figures of parts going one way and parts going the other way, there are actually parts going from UK to US, even though it's a kind of a much more limited thing. but I would tend to think that certainly part of the value to the US is this kind of tying Britain into their well, both the nuclear project, but also the overall foreign and defence policy project. And how formal that is in any sense, I couldn't say, but I think that certainly at specific points, Britain does tend to follow the US on key decisions, you know, and someone like Blair obviously is a key example of his determination to maintain that special relationship and pay the blood price for it, as he said. You know, that was obviously in a more specifically military thing, but I think that's bound up together. It obviously hasn't always been the case to that extent. So thinking back to the Vietnam War, of course, where Harold Wilson didn't send UK troops to Vietnam, you know, and again, that's a military thing, but nevertheless, it's kind of indicative of the kind of relationship, the strong relationship between the two countries that may ebb and flow a bit at certain points, but nevertheless, Britain is very tied in. And while Britain continues to have this idea that it wants to have the status of nuclear weapons, it can't do that without the US. So it's a kind of, you know, almost unbreakable relationship until such time as the British government realizes that it's not in its or anyone's interest to continue with the nuclear project.
Thank you, Kate. Dave?
Yeah, I think Kate's right. It's, you know, primarily the benefit that in their terms that the US derives from it are strategic. You know, there's this perceived benefit of having an extra sort of actor, a nuclear armed actor in, you know, historically in its competition, great power competition with the Soviet Union. And in technical terms, it's not entirely omnidirectional, as I said, and as Kate highlighted, we can see that with the components. When the treaty was signed, the fact that there had been separate research and development track that the UK had embarked upon, there were some things that they had done that were of interest to the US. So there was a sort of a weapon design that was colloquially called Super Octopus. I assume it's a reference to having lots of wires on the outside. But I believe that some of the design innovations that the UK, including Super Octopus, that the UK had developed during its time in isolation, were then incorporated into US designs. It's obviously quite a different picture now. The UK isn't, as far as we know, and you know, it seems to pretty clearly be the case that the UK isn't developing its own separate designs. There was at one time a belief that the UK had the sort of edge in hydrodynamics research. So this is what's called subcritical experiments, so where they basically blow up bits of nuclear material to see how it operates, and they use high-speed X-rays to monitor how the material reacts under those conditions, and then they use that data in computer modeling. So there was a time when the UK believed that they had an edge in hydrodynamics research. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think the benefits at the sort of research end are much more about having extra people and extra facilities working. So it's believed to be the case, for example, that the Orion laser facility at Aldermaston is specifically designed to have to work with different wavelengths complementary to the laser that the US has. So you've kind of got an idea and a planned sort of joint research capability where the two similar but distinct facilities are designed to be complementary rather than, you know, just replicating what the other one's doing. So I think the benefits are sort of more in that kind of area. The US also has a quite interesting setup where they have two nuclear weapons laboratories that are to some extent competitors. And believe that some people in the US program find it quite useful to have the UK as a third sort of research area that has non-competitive relationships with both participating in the research that they do. So I think it's in that kind of area where they get the benefits that they perceive. But again, coming back to the headline, it is much more about the US enabling the UK rather than a sort of entirely a relationship of equals.
Thanks for that. And on that point, I might quickly chuck another note in, because we have discussed it before I come back to other people's questions, Dave and Kate, is why do you, what is the political context of this happening now in terms of the permanent extension? Because obviously we've had it done on a 10-year basis before. So is there any particular political things going on perhaps in the US or elsewhere that are causing it to be made permanent? And then I'll come to the other chat questions.
I'm happy to comment on that. Yes, this is, I mean, you mentioned the key word there, what's going on in the US. And I think that there are a couple of things that are alarming developments that have been mooted recently, this being one of them. The other is the mooting of the development of a European nuclear weapons system. And that in particular, and I think the MDA thing as well, appear to be linked to concerns in the so-called defence establishment that a potential second Trump presidency and the uncertainty of what kind of policies he's going to be having and what he's going to do means that they want to lock down certain agreements. And I think locking down the MDA, I mean, you know, Trump's pretty contemptuous of Britain, I'm sure, or we know even, you know, he might quite easily decide one day he wants to end that, you know. So this is locking it down, so to speak. And then in terms of Trump saying, you know, NATO's all very well, but we're not going to defend any member states that haven't paid up properly. You know, hence concerns by European leaders that, oh, well, maybe we should get European nuclear weapons instead, you know, as if that's a simple or possible or legal thing to do even. But I'm sure that these developments are certainly linked to uncertainty in US policy.
I'd echo that. I think that's completely right. I think that's one of the things that's going on, and it's worth bearing in mind that these changes, whilst they remove, you know, the possibility of democratic scrutiny, they also to some extent reduce executive scrutiny. So, you know, the defence establishment can carry on with business as usual with much less input from the sort of elected political hierarchy under these arrangements, because there isn't a mechanism for review that needs to be signed off at ministerial level, for example. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the time limits put in place in Article 3 bis, you know, the reason that 3 bis was negotiated after the main treaty was that it was controversial, that, you know, there had been a long period where Congress had prevented any amount of information sharing by the US on nuclear weapons. So the context of this kind of tussle is where those time limits came from, and you know, that was the case now. In the present, the US Congress particularly is very supportive of the US continuing to enable the UK to be a nuclear weapon state, and so that, you know, the political context that created those time limits has changed as well.
Great, thank you very much both. So I'm going to finish with the last few questions. So thanks everyone for hosting them. So I'm going to ask two together, and then I'll ask Rebecca to ask her question herself, because I see Rebecca, you have your hand raised. But first of all, I hope I get this question right from Nicola. Tell me if I don't. So she says, Nicola Roberts says, when watching select committee questions, which I believe would be on this topic, you ask, you say you noted different protocols governing nuclear technology used by the US Navy for propulsion of subs, which I made I kind of interpret as you meaning conventionally armed subs or conventional subs, attack subs versus nuclear weapons. Could you elaborate, Nicola? Is that right? Is that what you wanted to ask?
Yeah, it seemed to be that the US allowed movement of technology to do with nuclear powered submarines, but it seemed as if the Navy had a embargo on technology to do with nuclear weapons on their subs. I didn't really understand it. I'd just like you to elaborate if you could.
Was that particularly in the context of sharing between the UK and US?
Yes, it seemed to be as if the US Navy didn't want to share or receive technology from the UK about weapons, but if it was information or materials being shared to do with nuclear propulsion of subs, that seemed to be permitted. I was just surprised that there was a distinction, really. I don't know whether it's basically because the treaty is supposed to just allow sharing of technology, but not actual warheads. Whereas perhaps it was just saying that they could have technology in bits or to do with nuclear powered propulsion, but they couldn't actually import a bomb from each other. I don't know. I didn't really understand it. That's why I'd like you to elaborate if you could. Do you recall the part in the select committee debate?
Not the specific one, but I'll answer as best I can in general terms. I would say that's probably about how the treaty's set up and how it functions and sort of about how bureaucracies work. So although the treaty allows for exchange of information on nuclear propulsion and on nuclear weapons, it does set out a list of purposes for which that information sharing can take place. And presumably there's some sort of internal bureaucratic process to approve the sharing of information under the treaty. So I imagine what you're looking at there is probably the procedures that they have in place to make sure that information sharing only takes place when it's been subject to the approval, so that to ensure that it fulfills those purposes that are set out in the treaty. I would guess that's probably the sort of underlying mechanism that you're seeing.
Thanks. Hope that answers your question, Nicola. Tom has another question, which is, it seems a bit remiss that no indication of costs in this whole affair are indicated in the mutual defence agreement. So for a budget-conscious new Labour government, why is this the case, and what cost do you think might be involved in this?
I could just say something about that. I mean, basically, recently C&D has been trying to update its figures on the cost of Trident replacement. Because about 10 years ago, we had the 205 billion figure. And with inflation and increasing costs of inputs and so on, and kinds of other things, that is bound to have increased. And we are desperately trying to find robust information and accessible information on this, and it's just not possible. And there seems to, well, thus far, we're going to carry on trying. It seems there's been a shutting down on information. And part of the problem is that both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons are now all thrown together in a nuclear enterprise thing. So you can't kind of separate them out in the way that you could before. And the government is, particularly since the 2021 integrated review, is much less transparent on all things related to nuclear stuff, so I think there's no way they're going to suddenly release lots of useful information in the context of the NDA or cost the relationship. That's just not going to happen, unfortunately. obviously we continue to press for information, but it's not forthcoming.
I'd agree with that. Should we move on to Rebecca's question in interest of time?
No problem. No problem. So Rebecca, would you like to unmute and ask a question? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And particularly thank you to Nis and David for the research and to alerting us, and also Kate for the background. So I'm really thinking about action, because clearly next week is far too soon for most of us to be able to get a meeting with our MPs and alert them. And I looked at the EDM and it's only got 13 signatories, which under the circumstances is not surprising. So my double part question really is, first of all, can we focus on trying to get a postponement of the deadline, kick it down at least to early 2025, I would say, so that we can, as civil society, raise it with our MPs, and the MPs can raise the kind of issues that Nis and C&D have raised with the government before this is just, signed off on. And I wonder whether if one of the things that could happen is to utilize sort of CND's much larger membership, perhaps connecting with something like 38 Degrees or a VAS that can at least raise the salient issues between now and the 23rd, to alert that this on an issue as important as this, that has, and this could be a place to raise the issue of cost as well, and as costly as this, if it is allowed just to go through on the nod, without proper parliamentary scrutiny, let alone civil society ability to raise concerns, constituency ability, and so on. So could that be done? Is that practical or possible to be done? But through CND, I think would be the only opportunity for that before the 23rd. But more broadly, what are the opportunities, if it does go through on the nod, for us to be campaigning on raising the concerns? I think it's much harder if it goes through on the nod. So I'd like to focus on how do we get a postponement?
Yeah, so David may well know about what possibilities there are technically for a postponement, which I don't actually know, I'm afraid. But just to say something about the kind of political opposition to it, and you mentioned the EDM only having 13 signatories. Now, I know over the years, signatories on EDMs generally have reduced because lots of MPs say, I can't do it, sign it for this or that reason, or they're opposed to it in principle, signing an EDM for some bizarre reason. But it's interesting to look at who are the signatories. So we've got 5 independents, 1 Labour, 3 Greens, and 4 Plaid Cymru. And that says quite a lot politically about where things are at in Parliament. Very noticeable is the lack of any SNP support, which we're investigating and trying to ascertain why. I know they've had their own concerns and preoccupations, and they're a much smaller cohort, but nevertheless, they are a body of politicians that have concerns around nuclear issues. Greens, that's pretty obvious. 5 independents, some of those are elected as independents and others are independent because they're kind of suspended from the Labour Party. And then 1 Labour, which is Bel Ribeiro Addy, who's Vice Chair of Parliamentary CND. And it's very, very difficult to generate any kind of action from actual current Labour Party MPs around anything which is deemed to be unacceptable to the government. That's the reality. So we're kind of trying to push a kind of stone uphill here in Parliament, but we will continue to do that, and Parliamentary CND will do whatever it can. And I think Rebecca's suggestions around a VAS and 38 Degrees and so on are good ones. It's a question really of what opportunities there are for postponement, which David, we look to you to tell us, really.
I mean, it's outside my area of expertise, so I'm referring, you know, again to the excellent briefings that the House of Commons Library put out on the subject. So the situation is that within the 21-day window, which due to Parliament's irregular sitting times lasts between publication of these proposed amendments in late July and the 23rd of October, within those 21 sitting days, either the Commons or the Lords can pass a resolution opposing the treaty being ratified, and that would delay the process. The government would have to publish a statement saying why they want the treaty to be ratified, and then there would be another 21 days within which, again, either house could oppose ratification. I don't have a good working knowledge of how parliamentary time is allocated, but my understanding of it is that it's pretty difficult for small groups, even small parties within the parliament, to command parliamentary time. There's quite limited opportunities for them to do so. As Kate's pointed out, actually a lot of people who've signed even the EDM, that, you know, these independent MPs are not part of a party at the moment. So I imagine the scope for them being able to command parliamentary time for debating, let alone passing a resolution, is pretty limited, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've got one final question, which will be the final question, from Elizabeth McElderry, who asks, do you see any effects on other agreements involving the UK, for example, the UK's nuclear relationship and research agreements with France? Or does the MDA have any other impact on other UK relations, including with TPNW signatories? I guess related to that is the question of how other countries look at this issue and the UK's pursuit of this relationship and its proliferation consequences. So yes, if anyone wants to answer that, we'll wrap up afterwards.
Well, I'll leave it to David to wrap up, but just to say that when I was reading around this, I did actually think, well, what about the relationship with France? You know, because it's not that long since there was all that kind of agreement and the sort of cooperation around Val-Duc and simulation of nuclear weapons testing and so on. And I haven't heard that has come to an end in any way, but I think it would be interesting to find out more about that, and hopefully David can share that information. Thank you.
I can say a little bit on that particular point. The Val-Duc facility, last I heard, is still being built. It's operational. The plan is to have 3 arrays of X-rays. I'm not quite sure sort of the far extent of my technical understanding of what they're doing there, but I possibly it's a sort of 3rd dimension in which they can observe the experiments, and I believe that 3rd array is still forthcoming. Last we heard, but we've got a big gap in published data, so we should have had some major projects data out over the summer that hasn't materialized, which would have let us know whether that project was still ongoing. I mean, summarizing, I guess I would thank everybody for coming, and I would encourage everybody to use what capabilities you have in drawing attention to this and encouraging, you know, robust parliamentary debates and scrutiny on the changes and on the relationship going forward. It's very clear from the legal opinion that was written in 2004 that the persistence of this relationship really calls into question the 2 states' intent to fulfill their obligations under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and the fact that they have now made this aspect of the treaty, or they're about to make this aspect of the treaty in place indefinitely, only underlines the extent to which it's really in tension with their disarmament obligations.
Excellent, nice way of summing that up. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining today. It's been a really interesting session. Obviously, do check out Nuclear Information Services website, because we do post regular updates on these topics, and do check out C&D's website and make use of the parliamentary lobbying tools. And this video will be posted online with other webinar videos we have. And I hope to see you next time. But I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and see you soon. Bye bye.